Cool. Hey, what's up, guys? Dr. Ashley Mack here at Hudson River Fitness. Today we're going to be talking about the deadlift and the different components of what makes the deadlift so successful. So one of our interns, Nelson Mejia, super great guy. He actually works for an organization up in West New York called Hope and Future, which is actually helping kids out after school, providing them with leadership opportunities and also some really cool opportunities when it comes to getting involved with the health and fitness. So he's going to help me out when it comes to discussing what the deadlift is and a couple things that we have to keep in mind, especially when it comes to making sure that you get the most benefit out of the deadlift, but then also making it so that you're able to do deadlifts on a longer term basis. So let's first start off with just like some general basic anatomy. We're going to draw a stick figure on the board. The idea is that the stick figure, it's just going to be demarcating the different types of joints that we have in our body. Now, when I'm drawing a stick figure, I'm going to use this straight line as our spine. Now, the thing about this spine is that it's made of multiple vertebrae. So the thing about it is the fact that there is going to be a little motion. But the reason why I draw a stick figure is being able to make it known that as you're moving, as you're doing a lot of this stuff, your goal is to have a rigid spine. So whether it be if you are wanting to do a squat or a deadlift or anything else like that, anything that we're focusing on trying to maintain a lot of tension, you're looking at having a super rigid spine. We then have our hips. Usually the hips, like the pelvis actually is demarcated, especially if you're looking at the side, is via a triangle. And then we have our hip joint, which is a circle, and then we have our femur, our knee, our shin, our ankle, and our foot. Now, before this video, Nelson and I were talking about the importance of squatting. So the squatting, when you're squatting, you're thinking about maximal close at knee and hip. So when it comes to squatting, your biggest focus is that you're going your hips backing down. So that's going to be the direction of where your hips are moving, back and down. Now on the other hand, for deadlifts, right? For deadlifts, we're thinking about closing at the hip mostly. That's going to be your biggest focus. There is going to be a little motion at the knee, but when it comes to deadlifting, we're actually focusing primarily on the hip hinge. Okay, so hinge, and your focus is forward and back. So what that actually really means, Nelson, is the fact that when you're squatting, you actually sit back and down. But when you are hinging, your focus is to be having your hips go back and forward. And what ends up happening is that you have a lot of motion here at the level of the hips, a little movement at the knee depending on how flexible your hamstrings are, and that's where you're gonna be able to generate a lot of force, a lot of power. So, with that being the case, there are a couple, let's talk about the end positions. We talk about the actual mechanics of what happens during this motion. So when it comes to squatting, we're gonna be looking at the torso actually kind of leans forward a little bit. Here's the pelvis and hip, while the knee and the ankle are here. So as you can see, there's closure at the knee, there's closure at the hip. Ideally, depending on the person, but ideally we're looking at trying to get the hip crease below the level of the knee. Now, depending on what your specific goals are, you might need to squat a little bit higher, you might need to squat a little bit lower, but that's kind of like the general rule of thumb. Things that you need to keep in mind is that your heel stays on the ground and that your torso leans forward, because prior to this, Nelson and I were talking about how if you were to arch, you actually lose the ability to maintain tension right here in your abs, which is actually going to be even more focused when we transition on over to deadlift. So this is going to be the squat motion. When it comes to deadlifting, we're looking at the torso actually moves a lot, maybe the knee just a little bit. And so as you can see, the hips actually do remain above the level of the knee, and we're actually strengthening what is called our posterior chain. So we're looking at hips and hamstrings with the squat, and also quads as well. When we're doing the deadlift, we're looking at mostly hamstrings, and also low back and the lats. And the thing is that these two, as you can see, I drew a straight line for the spine, the spine has multiple curvatures, but it's usually, like, I'm writing it as a straight line because we're making sure that the shape of your spine doesn't change from standing up to either the bottom of your squat or the bottom of your deadlift, which is gonna be biggest thing. Can you grab me that, yeah, towel, thank you. So, with that being the case, now that you've seen those two differences, right, we're gonna focus primarily on the deadlift. So again, it's gonna be maximal closure at the hip, a little bit at the knee, it's a hinge movement, and we're working on a forward and back type motion. So, a couple things to keep in mind. Forward and back, that's the movement of your hips, okay? So when I actually teach people how to deadlift, Nelson, I do a couple things. First off, it's all about creating that midline stability. So you're gonna go ahead and set your feet about hips width apart. Now, depending on whatever object you're picking up, it's going to really designate how wide your feet are gonna be or how narrow. If you're gonna be carrying something in between your feet are gonna have to get a little bit wider so that your hands can kind of get in between your feet. If it's something outside, say like a bar, your hands are gonna be a little bit more narrow. So, the idea is the following. We'll position our feet underneath our hips. From here, before we do anything else, you have to squeeze your butt, you have to squeeze your abs, and we have to pull the shoulder blades back and down. We're creating that 360-degree top and bottom tension, so then that way you can create as much tension and movement at the core so you can maximize movement at the level of the hips. Okay. The next thing that you're gonna do is you're just gonna slightly bend your knees. The reason why we slightly bend the knees is because a lot of people's hamstrings are really tight, and so if you try to hinge with straight knees, your hamstrings are gonna be in the way. So we're gonna bend the knees just slightly. We call this ungluing the knees. And all I'm gonna have you do, right, keeping everything tight, is you're gonna drive your hips back as far as you can. You're gonna let your torso come forward. And at this point, you should feel a tension right here at the level of the hamstring. Yeah, it's like you're sitting back, sitting your butt back, sitting your butt back. And at this point, you should feel, there it is, and go ahead and stand back up. Now, when you do this, when you drive your hips back and you let your torso come forward, you feel tension in your hamstrings. Your biggest focus is that when you're standing up, you're gonna be using the tension in your hamstrings to stand yourself up, being that you already feel what it's like already in your hamstrings. So let's do that again, right? So you're gonna slightly bend your knees, you're gonna push your butt back as far as you can, all right? So the idea is that Nelson's doing a really good job of keeping the back nice and flat. You're gonna keep your abs really, really tight. And at this point, those hamstrings get really, really tight, and he uses the tension in the hamstrings to stand all the way back up. Good, so that's like really the basic hinge. To take it a little bit farther, all you're gonna do is you're gonna be driving your hips back even farther, getting to the point where you just can't drive your hips back anymore, okay? So we're just gonna do that. You're gonna continue to push your butt back until you can't generate any more tension. So keep pushing the butt back. I think you have a little bit more on you. And if you feel like you're gonna fall back, that means that you have to let the torso come forward too. Your torso is gonna be that counterbalance. There we go, stop right there. If your hamstrings feel like they're gonna explode, that means that you're in the right position. And if you can see on the camera, Nelson's back is actually pretty flat. The angle, the shape of his back actually doesn't change. So go ahead and stand all the way back up. Probably it's hard to get your heart rate up a little bit just hanging out there, right? The thing is that the deadlift is probably the most neurologically taxing movements of the body. The reason is that we're faced with pictures and magazines, even like when you travel, or even like when you're like shopping, seeing like IKEA, everyone's picking something up with like a really upright torso. What ends up happening is when you're picking with a really upright torso, you actually don't have an opportunity to hinge. You end up doing more so of a squat. So here you are, you're trying to pick things up, you're like, okay, my knee is hurting, my quads are hurting, my back is hurting. Seems kind of counterintuitive though, to let that torso kind of rock forward. But then when you rock forward, you actually feel more tension in your hamstrings, you feel more tension in your abs, right? So just like, so a couple of cues that you're gonna hear pretty common when it comes to deadlifting is keeping the back flat, right? So we have back flat, I'm gonna write that down. We have flat back, we have arch, and then we have chest up. Couple of issues with, these aren't bad cues. These are like, there's a reason why these are most commonly used. Like they work when it comes to helping people maintaining a certain position when it comes to these deadlifts. First is a flat back. Of course you want a flat back. Flat backs are really important. But also like a rounded back is not the end of the world either. really the idea with the flat back is to make sure that the shape of your spine doesn't change throughout this lift. So if you're gonna pick something up with a rounded back, you have to create tension in your rounded back. And like that's outside the scope of what this video is talking about. We'll talk about picking something awkward off the floor. Arching is another good cue because that it's easy to tell someone to arch their back, and that'll teach them to keep their back super rigid. So like when it comes to arching the back, they're onto something, and it helps you keep your back super rigid. Same thing with the chest up. If someone's like, arch your back, you're like, I don't know how to arch my back. You have the chest up. It's like, okay, I know that I need to keep my chest up. So these two things will lead to an extended low back or the lumbar spine. And so what ends up happening, right, is Nelson, I want you to do that same hinge, right? But don't worry about like the chest or anything. Like, you push your butt back, let the torso come forward, okay? Right now, Nelson's feeling a lot of tension in his hamstrings. Now I want you to try to arch and keep your, like, pull your chest up for me. What ends up happening is like Nelson's head comes up, his back extensors get like really tense, and he's probably feeling some tension in his quads now. Again, this is not a bad position, but we're looking at really not the most effective position. And actually, Nelson's resting on his thighs because like this, he's talking about this is miserable. We'll go ahead and stand back up. This is not a bad position. It's actually, if anything, it's going to allow him to maintain a super flat back, especially when he's pulling something off the floor. But one of the biggest limitations with that is, yes, he probably won't be able to engage his hamstrings enough. But we were talking about in our past video about when you're arching, it doesn't allow you to maintain your tension right here in the anterior chain, your abs and your midline. And so with that, we're going to be talking about like the importance of a couple other cues. Oh, and the reason why like these are so successful is because it's easy to tell someone to do this. Because again, they're working off of what culture has set out for us, like via IKEA boxes and like luggage and whatever. It's easy to tell someone to keep their chest up versus what we're going to talk about next is bringing the chest down, okay? So a couple cues that I like to use is ribs down, chest down, and forward. And so the thing is that you would think that if you're going down, right, you're hinging and you're like chest down, ribs down, that you would think they would fold over like an accordion. Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, you do these two motions, it's gonna take a lot of like mental energy because like you are literally fighting against everything that you've been taught in the past where it's like arch up, chest up. But the moment you pull your ribs down, the moment you pull your chest down and you're forward, you're gonna start to experience a little bit more tension in your midline. You're gonna be able to get into a lot more of a better position, your hamstrings will get engaged. And so that's what we were doing before. Like when Nelson was doing this, like Nelson, you were actually focusing on driving the hips back, your chest comes forward, and you were probably able to notice that there was tension right about here. And in a previous video I was talking about with Nelson was the aspect of when it comes to muscles and acting on the front and back aspects of the body, you have your glutes, which is like the top portion of your pelvis going down to your thigh. You have your hamstrings, which goes from the back lower portion of your pelvis down to your knee. And then you have your back extensors as well. So that's kind of like what we call our posterior chain. That's actually what we're going to be able to train when it comes to working on the deadlift. But what often gets neglected or kind of misused is the anterior chain. So the anterior chain, we'll start from the bottom up. We have our quad muscles, which goes from our shin bone to our pelvis, which is right here. Then we have our ab muscles, which go from like pretty much our ribs all the way down towards our pelvis. But then what often gets overlooked or misused are our hip flexors, your psoas muscles, your iliacus, your iliopsoas, and your psoas muscles. So, which actually inserts, it originates at your lumbar spine, the front aspect of your lower back, and it attaches to your hip. So as you can see, there should be a balance between these motions. And when it comes to a balance, you need to be able to have proper function of these muscles. So when it comes to this hip hinge, Nelson, go ahead and get into your hip hinge. And that way, like, it's better for you to feel it than to kind of just talk about it. So here's Nelson, his torso's forward. What ends up happening is go ahead and bring your hips up just a little, hips up. There we go. Hamstrings are engaged. The quads are okay. We're going to shift the weight forward a little bit more. And that way the hamstrings are really engaged. And at this point, like Nelson's able to squeeze his abs and his back is nice and tight, but it's not super overextended. At this point, everything is kind of working in sync. Now, Nelson, what I want you to do is I want you to pull your chest up and arch your back for me. When he does this, what ends up happening, the muscles that are responsible for pulling the chest up are the low back extensors. But then also what's going to accentuate this curve right here is going to be Nelson's hip flexors from his from his low back down to his hips. So go ahead and stand back up. It was probably hard to maintain that position. So like what ends up happening is that here you are in this position and your body's just like fighting. And a lot of people will talk about when they squat that their hips start to experience a pinch, or that or when they're deadlifting, they're like, oh, my back is sore every single time. And it's because the back should be used as a stabilizer, but when it works more than a stabilizer, that's where things start to get a little bit on the funkier side. So that's going to be the biggest focus, is that ribs down, chest down, and forward will be two very, very important cues for you to focus on, whether you are new to deadlifting or not. And so being able to lift through your core. I also tell people to trust their hips, because a lot of people, it's all about trust and believing in yourself. Unless you have, say, like a true, say, injury where like there's something that happens to your soft tissue, or you have like a spinal injury, like true actual weakness, it's just you have the strength there, it's just that you haven't necessarily figured out what works best for you, or like how to use the strength to your advantage. So because of that, you're gonna end up using muscles that are just gonna fry you, and you're gonna be like, my back hurts, my hips hurt. And that's where you're gonna start to notice that if you implement stuff like this, your back is most likely gonna feel better, your hips are gonna feel better, your hamstrings are gonna feel less tight too, because the overuse of these hip flexors and all this other stuff, this misbalance in the hips, is gonna have a huge impact. And interestingly enough, someone telling you that you're tight in a specific area but not providing any sort of solution, it's in a tough position, because it's kind of like, okay, you have a problem, and then you're like, so what do I do about it? But they don't tell you what to do. That's a big issue as well. And one of the big things that I've been discussing with Nelson is that it's our job as coaches, or even physical therapists, to be able to figure out, is this person having issues doing this specific movement? Is it because they're actually like truly inflexible? Do they have like an actual like legitimate muscular imbalance? Or for us as coaches, like, do we actually just have to change up the way that we present this message, so that way it resonates with the person, be able to get this said stimulus down? So yeah, any questions?
I think got it all pretty clear.
Yeah, all pretty clear. So just to kind of overview, biggest thing is that deadlift, we want to focus on maximal closer at the hip. It's a hinge at the hip, and then you're thinking about forward and back. And then from there, you can just keep those in mind, and everything else will fall into place. If you're having issues, if you're like, I don't feel really comfortable, remember, you want to be able to keep your ribs down, and you want to get your chest down and forward, and then trust in yourself. Trust your hips. All right, so we'll do that one more time, Nelson. Once you position your feet about hips width apart, from here you're going to keep your abs tight. From here you're going to bend the knees. You're going to push your hips back as far as you can. You're going to let the torso come forward. So right now, Nelson's kind of squatting, right? So he's going to go ahead and stand back up. Stand back up for me. All right, bend the knees just a little bit. Your knees don't bend any more than that, okay? You're going to go hips back. You're going to go chest forward, hips back, eyes down. Yeah, push the hips back, push the hips back, push the hips back. Keep going. Once Nelson starts to kind of round here, we know that if he has reached the limit of his hamstring, so like we're going to go up just a little bit. There we go. And that way, if I were to grab his hamstring, I can feel that it's tension. This is not a comfortable position for Nelson, but this should probably actually feel like a little bit better on his back. And then from here, whether he's picking something up from the floor, or even from a couple of plates, he should be able to pick it up no problem, because he's using his hamstring. So go ahead and stand up and using those hamstrings. All right, so that's what we got. Cool.
Nice.
How long was that video?